In the autumn of 1909, in a version of America that runs alongside our own, a man named Edmund Garrison Halloway walked into the headquarters of the Continental Petroleum and Refining Combination on Lower Broadway, set down a sealed envelope on the desk of his superior, and walked out of the building without saying a word to anyone. Inside that envelope was a letter of resignation. But it was not an ordinary resignation. Halloway had been one of the most senior executives at Continental, a man who had spent 23 years inside the company that, in the world of this story, controlled most of the refined oil sold in the United States. He was wealthy. He was secure. He was, by every measure the world used in that age, a man who had won. And yet on the morning of October the 14th, he threw all of it away. The reason was a single document that had been circulating quietly through the private offices of the great industrialists for almost a year. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. A document that, at the time, was referred to only as the Education Plan. A plan funded in part by the Ashworth Foundation for National Improvement, supported by the trustees of the Bellamy General Education Trust, and shaped by a small circle of advisors whose names most Americans would never learn. Halloway had read it. He had attended 3 private meetings about it. He had been asked to lend his signature to the section that dealt with industrial pupil placement, and he refused. His resignation letter was 4 pages long, written in his own hand. What it said and what it asked is the subject of this film. A word, before we begin, about the story you are about to hear. The men in it are invented. The Continental Combination, the Ashworth Foundation, the Bellamy Trust, all of them are inventions placed alongside the real history of the period. The era, however, is real. The questions raised inside it are real. The kind of debate we are about to describe, although our specific meetings did not occur, is drawn from the broader argument that historians of American education have carried on for more than half a century about how the modern school system in this country came to look the way it does. This is a story. But it is a story drawn from the shape of what was actually being argued, in many rooms by many men, in the offices of the great industrial fortunes of the turn of the 20th century. Halloway was born in 1858 in a small Pennsylvania oil town, the only son of a general store owner whose business was ruined by the Depression of the 1870s and by the slow consolidation of the regional refineries into the single great combination that the Continental Petroleum and Refining Company would later become. The family moved to Cleveland in search of work when Edmund was 15. By 19, he was a junior clerk in the accounting department of the company that, in the imagination of this story, had absorbed his father's livelihood. He worked there for the next 40 years. He was good at numbers. He was quiet. He did not drink. He did not speak about politics. He attended a small Methodist church and lived alone in a narrow brownstone for most of his adult life. He never married. He had no children. He rose slowly through the company, never by ambition, but by the simple fact that the men above him kept retiring or dying, and there was always work to be done. By 1898, he was running the Cleveland Accounts Office. By 1903, he had been moved to New York. By 1907, he was one of 7 men who had access to what was called the inner ledger, the actual financial position of the entire Continental Combination. He had become, without ever wanting to be, one of the most informed men in the country about how money in his industry actually moved. To understand what happened next, we have to understand the world he was sitting inside. By 1907, the great industrial empires of the late 19th century were facing a problem they had not anticipated. They had won. The railroads were built, the steel mills were running, the oil refineries were running, the mines were running. The men who had assembled these empires were, individually, the richest human beings who had ever lived up to that point in history. They had more than they could spend. They had more than their children could spend. And yet they were not at peace. The country around them was changing in ways that troubled them. The labor movement was growing. The populist movement had come and gone, but its energy had not disappeared. The muckraking journalists were beginning to publish detailed histories of how these fortunes had actually been built. There were court cases, there were investigations, there were senators making speeches, and there was a growing sense in the private rooms at the top of the industrial order that something would have to be done about the next generation. Not the next generation of executives, the next generation of ordinary Americans, the workers, the voters, the mothers, the school children. The answer the men in this story arrived at, over a period of roughly 15 years, was education. Not education in the old sense, not the small one-room schoolhouse, not the local academy, not the church-funded grammar school, not the apprenticeship, and not the family farm where children learned by working alongside their parents. What they meant by education was something new, a national system, a standardized system, a system that would take in every child in the country at the age of 6 or 7, and would hold that child for 12 years, and would shape that child according to a pattern that had been designed in advance. The pattern would be designed by experts. The experts would be trained at the new schools of education that were being established at the great universities, schools that the Ashworth Foundation and the Bellamy Trust in our story were funding directly. The teachers would be trained by those experts. The textbooks would be approved by committees overseen by those experts. The tests would be written by those experts. And the result over a generation would be a population that was literate enough to follow written instructions, numerate enough to handle a payroll stub, obedient enough to arrive at a factory at 7 in the morning, and educated enough to vote in a way that did not threaten the existing order. This is, in broad outline, the argument that the critical historians of American education have made about what actually occurred between roughly 1890 and 1920. The argument is not universally accepted. There are serious historians who will tell you that the great philanthropists of the early 20th century were sincere reformers who believed they were lifting the country up. There are serious historians who will tell you that the foundations of that era did things in the area of public health and library access and university funding that improved the lives of millions of Americans in ways that no one disputes. And there are serious historians who will tell you that alongside those genuine improvements, there was also something else, quieter and harder to see, which was the slow refashioning of the American population into a shape that was more convenient to the institutions that funded the refashioning. The debate has gone on ever since. Our story is set inside the version of events in which the second account is closer to the truth. What Edmund Halloway saw sitting inside Continental in 1908 and 1909 was something narrower and more specific than the general outline. He saw the part of the plan that the public never saw. He saw the part that dealt with what was called industrial pupil placement, and it was that part of the plan that he refused to sign. The first meeting was held in the spring of 1908 in a private dining room on the upper floor of a club on 44th Street in New York. Halloway was invited because he was one of the few men inside Continental who understood both the numbers and the people. He had a reputation for being trustworthy. He had a reputation for not talking. The men in the room that evening included 2 officers of the Ashworth Foundation, one senior trustee from the Bellamy Education Trust, a vice president of a large Eastern university, an attorney who represented several of the largest manufacturing firms in the country, and 3 Continental executives of whom Halloway was the most junior. Dinner was served at 7. The conversation that mattered did not begin until after 10. What was discussed at that meeting, according to the resignation letter Halloway later wrote, was a proposal to fund, through a combination of foundation money and corporate contributions, a national program of vocational sorting. The idea was that the new high schools, which were then expanding rapidly across the country, would not simply teach a single curriculum to all students. They would, instead, sort students into tracks. Some students would be tracked into preparation for college and the professions. Some students would be tracked into clerical and commercial work. Some students would be tracked into skilled industrial labour, and the great majority, in the proposal as it was then drafted, would be tracked into general industrial labour, which meant the factory floor, the warehouse, the mine, the construction site, and the agricultural labour force. The sorting would be done early. It would be done by tests. The tests would be developed by the new educational psychology departments at the foundation-funded universities. And the results of the tests would be recorded in a uniform format on what was called the pupil's permanent record, which would follow the child from one school to the next and eventually from the school to the prospective employer. Halloway listened. He did not say very much that first evening. He understood what he was hearing. He understood that the men in the room were proposing, in effect, the creation of a labour pipeline that would deliver on demand the precise number of workers needed by each sector of the industrial economy, sorted by aptitude and by region, and trained to expect the kind of work into which they had been placed. He understood that the moral and intellectual development of the children involved was not, in the language of that meeting, the primary objective. He understood that the primary objective was the smoothing of the labour market and the prevention of what one of the men present had referred to earlier in the evening as the wastage of human capacity in directions inconsistent with national productive need. The second meeting was held in October of 1908 at a country house in northern New Jersey. Halloway attended. He took notes. He went home and could not sleep. He spent the next 3 months reading. He read the early reports of the educational psychologists then publishing their first papers. He read the new textbooks being prepared for the elementary grades. He read the addresses being given at the meetings of the teaching associations. He read the speeches that the leading philanthropists in the world of our story had been giving at the dedications of new schools and new libraries. He was looking for the place where the language of the meetings he had attended would emerge openly in the public record. He did not find it. The public language was a language of uplift, of opportunity, of the betterment of the common man. The private language, the language he had heard in the dining room on 44th Street and in the country house in New Jersey, was a different language entirely. It was a language of sorting, of placement, of yield, and of control. The third meeting was held in June of 1909. By that point, the plan had been refined. It had been broken into sections. Each section was to be implemented through a different vehicle. The curriculum section would be implemented through one of the national teaching associations. The teacher training section would be implemented through the new schools of education at 3 named universities. The testing section would be implemented through a new committee that was then being assembled in Boston. And the industrial pupil placement section, the section that dealt specifically with the channeling of working class children into the labour pipeline, was to be implemented through a network of private corporate sponsors, of whom the Continental Combination was to be one of the founding members. Halloway was asked at that meeting to commit Continental to an initial contribution of $1.5 million, payable over 5 years, in exchange for which the company would have what was called consultative input into the design of the industrial track in 3 named eastern cities. He was given a draft of the section to take home and review. He took it home. He read it twice. He sat at his desk in his narrow brownstone for an entire weekend in October of 1909, and he wrote his resignation letter. He begins the letter formally. He addresses it to the executive committee. He thanks them for the years of employment and for the trust they have placed in him. He acknowledges that the work he is about to refuse to do is work that, in their judgment, is in the long-term interest of the company. He says that he understands their reasoning. He says that he does not believe their reasoning to be wrong from the standpoint of the company's profits. He says, however, that he can no longer participate in the project and that he must, therefore, resign. The reasons he gives are arranged under 4 headings. He does not number them. He simply works through them one after another in long, careful paragraphs. The first reason is that the plan, in his judgment, will not produce the workers it claims to produce. It will produce, instead, a population that has been taught from the age of 6 that its purpose is to be sorted, and that the sorting is being done by people who know better than the sorted person himself what that person is capable of. He says that he has seen, in the development of the great industrial trusts, what happens to a man when he is told, year after year, that he is not in charge of his own work. He says that such a man becomes eventually incapable of being in charge of his own work. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. He becomes instead a man who waits to be told. And a country full of such men, Holloway writes, is not a country that will be able to defend its own freedoms when those freedoms are eventually contested. He notes that the men proposing the plan appear not to have considered this risk. He notes that this is because the men proposing the plan have themselves never been sorted by anyone. The second reason he gives is that the plan, in its present form, is a plan to make the public school into an instrument of private corporate planning. He says that he has no objection to private corporate planning. He has spent his life inside it. He says, however, that the public school is not a corporation. It is paid for in the main by the taxes of the parents whose children attend it. Those parents, he writes, are not aware that the curriculum their children will receive is being designed in private meetings funded by men whose names do not appear on the school board ballot. He says that this is not, strictly speaking, a violation of any law of which he is aware. He says that it is, however, a violation of something older than the law, which is the basic understanding between a free people and the institutions they have built and paid for. He says that the plan, in this respect, is dishonest, not because it conceals a crime, but because it conceals an authorship. The people of the country will be told that their schools are being improved by the wisdom of educators. They will not be told that the educators are being trained at schools funded by men who have, as one of their primary objectives, the production of a more tractable workforce. He says that he cannot in good conscience lend his signature to a document that has been designed, in part, to be misunderstood by the people it will affect. The third reason he gives is, in some ways, the strangest of the four. He says that the plan, as it has been described to him, contains an assumption that he believes to be false. The assumption is that human capacity in any given child can be measured by an external test administered at a young age. He says that he has worked for 40 years alongside men whose capacities he initially misjudged, in both directions. He says that he himself was considered, as a young clerk in Cleveland, to be of limited promise, and that the men who initially placed him at the bottom of the ledger department were wrong. He says that any system that purports to sort children by capacity at the age of 8 or 9 or 10 will inevitably misplace a significant fraction of those children, and that the misplaced children will not, in the normal course of life, ever recover from the misplacement, because the system itself will be arranged in such a way as to confirm the original judgment. He says that this is not a flaw in the plan that can be corrected by better tests. It is a flaw, he writes, in the very idea that a human being can be tested. The fourth reason he gives is the one that takes up the most space in the letter. He says that he has been a Methodist all his life, and that although he has never been a particularly devout man, he has held to certain ideas which he learned as a child. One of those ideas is that a human soul is not a quantity to be allocated by a committee. He says that he does not propose to lecture the executive committee on theology. He says that he understands that the men he is addressing do not, in general, conduct their business affairs on the basis of religious conviction, and that they would not expect him to do so either. But he says that there is, beneath the question of theology, a simpler question. Whether a child, any child, belongs in the first instance to the child's parents and to the child himself, or whether a child belongs in some sense to the productive economy of the nation. He says that the plan, in the form in which it has been presented to him, has answered that question in the second way. It has treated the child as a unit of future production, whose placement in the economy is the primary concern of the institutions through which the child will pass. He says that he is not prepared to answer the question in that way. He says that he believes, although he cannot prove it, that the men proposing the plan would not themselves, accept its terms if those terms were applied to their own children. He notes that the children of the men proposing the plan will not, in fact, be sorted by the system that the plan is designed to create. They will attend a small number of private schools in a small number of cities which the plan does not touch and is not intended to touch. The sorting, he writes, is for other people's children, and it is for that reason, above all others, that he cannot lend his signature to it. The letter closes briefly. He repeats his gratitude. He returns the keys to his office. He requests that his final pay be calculated through the end of the month and forwarded to his residence. He signs his name. He folds the letter. He places it in the envelope. He walks to the office of his superior. He sets it down. He leaves. What happened to Edmund Halloway after that morning is, in the quiet logic of our story, the part that gets remembered least. He did not give interviews. He did not write a book. He did not testify before any of the committees that were then beginning to investigate the great industrial combinations. He moved out of New York at some point in 1910, and he settled in a small town in upstate New York, near the Finger Lakes, where he bought a modest 2-story house and lived for the remaining 26 years of his life on the proceeds of his accumulated stock. He read widely. He attended the local Methodist church. He gave money quietly to the local library and to scholarships at the nearby state college. He never spoke publicly about the plan, or about the meetings, or about the letter. He died in 1936 at the age of 78, of pneumonia, in his own bed, attended by a niece who had moved in some years earlier to look after him. The plan he had refused to sign went forward in the world of our story, without him. The industrial pupil placement section, in the form he had seen, was implemented over the following 2 decades, although not always under that name and not always in the cities originally proposed. The vocational sorting that he had described in his letter became, by the 1930s, a routine feature of the high school. The pupil's permanent record, with its standardized test results and its teacher commentary and its aptitude classifications, became the document that followed every child from kindergarten through to graduation. The schools of education at the universities continued to train, year after year, the administrators who designed the system. The foundations in our story continued to fund the research that supported it. By the time of the Second World War, the system Halloway had described in his letter was simply the system. Most people had grown up inside it. Most people had no memory of any other arrangement, and no reason to suppose that the arrangement they had grown up inside had been designed by anyone in particular. The critics, when they emerged, came from unexpected directions. They came from inside the school system itself, from teachers who had spent 30 years inside the classroom, and had come to believe that the classroom, as they had been trained to run it, was not what it claimed to be. They came from historians working in later decades who began to assemble the foundation records and the philanthropic correspondence and the early educational psychology papers, and who began to publish accounts of what they believed had happened. They came from parents who began to ask why their children were spending 12 years in an institution that did not seem to produce, at the end of those 12 years, the kind of educated citizen the institution had always claimed it would produce. And they came, more recently, from a smaller and somewhat scattered group of researchers who have begun to revisit the original sources and to ask whether the system was, in fact, designed to do what it has done, rather than failing to do what it was supposed to do. That question is at the center of what Halloway saw in our story and of what he wrote about in his resignation letter. He did not believe that the system would fail to do what it was designed to do. He believed that the system would succeed in doing what it was designed to do, and that what it was designed to do was different from what the public would be told it was designed to do. He believed that the gap between the public language and the private language of the project would never be closed because the project depended on that gap. And he believed that the men proposing the project knew this perfectly well. Whether he was right is a question that each generation, in the world of this story and in our own, has to answer for itself. There are honest historians who will say that the great philanthropists of that era were sincere, and that the schools they helped to build were, on balance, a gift. There are honest historians who will say that the schools they helped to build were, on balance, a cage. And there are honest historians who will say that they were both at once, and that the cage and the gift cannot be separated without unravelling the entire fabric of what came after. What our story has given us is one voice. The voice of one invented man who sat in 3 meetings and read one document and decided that he could not lend his name to it. He is not a hero in any obvious sense. He did not lead a public campaign. He did not try to stop the project. He simply refused to participate, and he went home and lived quietly for another 26 years. His refusal cost him nothing material. The cost, if there was a cost, was internal. It was the cost of having seen something and of having to live for the rest of his life with the knowledge of what he had seen, while the world around him continued not to see it. That signature, in the end, is what the story comes down to. A man sat at his desk in his narrow brownstone in Lower Manhattan on a Sunday evening in October of 1909, and he decided not to do something. He decided not to put his name to a document that had been placed in front of him. The document went forward without him. The plan it was part of went forward without him. The world it helped to build is a world we recognize. The schools that were attended, the tests that were taken, the records that followed children from one institution to the next, the expectations that were placed on those children before they were old enough to know that expectations were being placed. All of that is, in the logic of this story, part of the inheritance of the meetings Halloway sat through and the document he refused to sign. Whether his refusal mattered in the end is hard to say. The plan went forward. The system was built. The country was reshaped. One man's resignation, however considered, however principled, did not change the trajectory of the great institutions that were then taking shape. And yet there is something in the act itself, in the simple fact that a man sat in the room and listened and then said no, that seems worth telling. Not because it stopped anything, but because it imagines, in a single document, the moment at which the design of a system might have become visible to one of the people who had been asked to design it. Edmund Garrison Halloway, in our story, died in 1936. He is buried in a small cemetery on a hill above the Finger Lakes, in a plot that he purchased for himself in 1912, 2 years after he left New York. The headstone gives only his name and the dates of his birth and his death. There is no epitaph. The letter he wrote remained folded for the rest of his life, inside the back cover of a ledger on the top shelf of his study, where he sometimes took it down on quiet evenings and read it through, and then folded it again and put it back. He never showed it to anyone. He never sent the copy he had kept to a newspaper or to a historian or to a friend. He carried what he had seen for the rest of his life, alone, and he carried it well. We will leave the story there where Halloway himself left it. We will not draw a moral. We will not tell you what to think about the schools, or about the foundations, or about the men who built them, or about the country those institutions helped to shape. We will only say this. There was, in the version of America that runs alongside our own, a man named Edmund Garrison Halloway, who sat in 3 private meetings and read one document, and on the morning of October the 14th, in the autumn of 1909, walked into the offices of the Continental Combination at the southern end of the city, and set down on the desk of his superior a sealed envelope, and walked out of the building and never went back. Inside that envelope was a letter. The letter said no, and the questions that letter raised more than 100 years later are still being argued by the historians who have spent their working lives studying the period from which this story was drawn. Thank you for listening.